have an absolutely fabulous topic at hand too. So let me formally welcome you to the EGROW webinar series. This is, I think, the 206th or 207th webinar we are doing. EGROW is basically aiming at policy-oriented research. And since our inception in October 31, 2018, we have been taking all types of research. We have been taking desk research, we have been taking survey-based research. We are also disseminating information and knowledge through our webinar series. We have been very fortunate to have a blend of Indian and foreign scholars to come and speak to us. Also, we have a blend of topics which are contemporary issues in India and contemporary issues in the rest of the world. So we have been very fortunate to have this blend successfully done. We have had two Nobel laureates who have spoken to us. We are pursuing two more who should come and speak to us soon. So in that context of handling contemporary issues, as well as having a blend of Indian and foreign scholars, today we are very fortunate that Rick Rossow has agreed to be with us. I know him for a couple of years now when I was a professor at IIM Bangalore, and he has done an excellent research on power sector reforms. Now, power sector reforms are something which are crucial in our country, though I come with age and experience where we have passed through very difficult times in the power sector. There's been electric shortages all over the country. Some states are even experiencing it today. And the timings then when the power cuts happen are so unknown that people's life and especially the farmer's life and sometimes the MSME life in the MSMEs goes totally disarray. So Rick has done a good amount of research on the power sector reforms, and we thought it would be great to have him with us, and we can take advantage of his research. I did not know, but Rick was traveling in India and he has traveled to 8 different states and presented his research to them. And during his presentation, we will learn more from him. Now, I must introduce Rick before we go further. Rick is a senior advisor and holds the chair in US-India Policy Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this role, he helps frame and shape policies to promote greater business and economic engagement between the two countries, with a unique focus on tracking and engaging Indian states. He has been working on US-India relations for over 25 years. He joined CSIS in 2014, and that's around the time when I first met him. After a long career in a range of private sector roles focused on India, prior to CSIS, he served as Director for South Asia at McLarty Associates, leading the firm's work for clients in India and the neighboring region, and he retains his affiliation with the firm. From 2008 to 2012, he was with New York Life Insurance Company, most recently as head of international governmental affairs, where he developed strategic plans for the company's public policy and global mergers and acquisitions work and helped manage the firm's policy issues in India. From 1998 to 2008, he served as Deputy Director of the US-India Business Council, the world's leading advocacy group on behalf of strengthening economic ties between the United States and India. While at USIBC, which is the US-India Business Council, he managed the council's policy groups in the energy information technology, insurance, media, and entertainment and telecommunication sectors. He received his BA from Grand Valley State University in Michigan. Now let me go straight to Rick Rossow and request him to share his thoughts research with us for about 40 odd minutes, and then we'll open up for question answers. Rick, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks for that warm introduction. I would say winning a Nobel Prize sounds nice, but the fact that Dr. Singh felt that some of my research was worth presenting, To me, that's about as good as a Nobel Prize. So I really appreciate you offering me to be able to present this work we did.
Thank
The bio is part of the story, but my work, as some of you may know, is very heavily focused on state level policy making in India. A lot of attention, of course, on what happens by the union government, but there's less attention, detailed attention on what's happening at the state level. Overall, I'm a bit of a generalist, but I have had the chance with some of my past work to be able to do deep dive in a couple of sectors, including energy. Some of my early work, as Dr. Singh noted, with the U.S. India Business Council, that kind of first wave of U.S. investment in India back in the 1990s, some of the biggest and most notable investments was grid-scale power generation. And many of us remember Enron and the DeVol project, but actually there was about a dozen projects built in India by a range of U.S. companies, and it wasn't just Maharashtra, but it was Odisha, it was Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and on down the list. And no matter where they were and where they invested, they always had problems getting paid. Contracts weren't honored. Legal restitution, of course, takes some time unless you're willing to put a lot of money behind it. So some of my early work, and the reason I have this kind of unique focus on state level policymaking, it's not so much for me, an academic exercise. I read a story one time that states are important, but in fact, it's very practical. My job at USIBC was taking delegations of executives from these energy companies that were owed hundreds of millions of dollars by state utilities. And we would show up in New Delhi during the Vajpayee government years, and we'd meet with the power minister and the power secretary, and they'd complain about how much money they were owed in Tamil Nadu. And we were basically told there's nothing we can do in Delhi to get Tamil Nadu to pay its bills. You need to engage the state government there directly. So, for me, I learned the hard way how the balance of power really does kind of favor in a lot of these areas state governments. And on top of that, the fact that despite many, many programs over many years, looking back at the Accelerated Power Reform Development Program during the Vajpayee government and the Electricity Act amendments to break apart the electricity boards, the attempt late during the UPA government to try to initiate a major reform of DISCOMs, the Modi government coming in and announcing the Ujjwal Discom Yojana Assurance Program, the UDAY program. It's tough work. And a lot of times these big programs the union government tries to do to help states perform, they'll have a bit of a blip where things kind of improve. But after a couple of years, it by and large goes back to the status quo. Now here I am at CSIS for the last 10 years. And again, we have this really sharp focus on state level policymaking. And many of you that are familiar with the think tank universe, my real day job is building up funded projects to pay for our work and pay for my staff. Because of the state's approach that we have, a majority of the projects that I have today are in the energy and climate space. That's where for major foundations, which is where my program primarily gets its funding from, that's where a lot of the attention and interest is. And they're focused on big picture issues like how do you get more gigawatts of renewable energy into India. I always kind of look at that and say it's a little bit like trying to put out the fire by shooting water at the tip of the flames. It's great, to get more gigawatts of renewable energy for energy transition and combating climate change. But a lot of states that have big plans on renewable energy and energy transition, they're not really going to be able to carry that out unless they have better operational improvements of the electricity sector writ large. So while I'm doing a number of projects to initiate technical exchanges and work with state governments across India on what are the right choices on storage and emerging renewable energy models, I always kind of felt that we're doing a disservice if we're only focusing on the downstream stuff. And unless more states improve the operations of their distribution utilities, it's going to be pretty hard to be able to meet these energy transition obligations that the states themselves and certainly the union government say that they want to be able to initiate. So, some of my experience going back to the 1990s when Odisha was the first state that privatized electricity, and having seen a lot of case examples in Delhi and, of course, earlier examples in Mumbai and Kolkata and places, every year the Power Finance Corporation puts out this ranking of DISCOMs, and it's become increasingly noticeable over time that the private DISCOMs just all tend to be stuck near the top in terms of the rankings. A few states like Haryana and Gujarat have been able to initiate meaningful reforms of their state-run distribution utilities. but a lot of times it becomes noticeable that the private entities tend to do a lot better than the public ones did. And I know there's a little bit of cherry picking because a lot of private ones go to major urban areas where you have the high paying consumers, a little bit easier in smaller spaces to cut down on some of the theft and loss and such. But even despite that fact, even when private companies do take on rural consumers, they've shown real operational improvement. So that was kind of the reason we felt doing this report would be pretty important, because we think that some states that don't have the political ability to initiate meaningful reforms of the state-run discoms, maybe they should look at some form of privatization as a way to kind of offset. I'll at this point I'll call up the presentation there, because I've got a couple of slides that I want to be able to show as we sort of walk through, pulling some of the graphics and such from the report that we've done. So, first and foremost, again, a lot of my driver for doing this is on energy transition, but not entirely. When you think about the Modi government's big initiatives like Make in India, or the interest in expanding the accessibility of basic public services to the masses, there's a lot of reasons why improvements in electricity distribution are important for India. Dr. Singh mentioned quite a few of those during the opening. Here I'm taking a look very specifically at one of the big drivers for a lot of my work, which is energy transition. Today, you've got just a small number of states that really, when you look at wind and solar, have really been the major drivers. And in fact, 4 states, really Rajasthan, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka are just well far ahead and zooming ahead in terms of the adoption of renewable energy, wind and solar in particular. But if India really wants to hit a lot of these major commitments, they've got 450 gigs of renewable by 2030, 500 gigs of non-fossil fuel by 2030. More states have got to begin pulling at the oars. It's easy to say that states like Rajasthan that have a lot of desert land and good solar profile can fuel the rest of the country. But a lot of my work with state governments, you also find that many states are getting tired of buying all their electrons from another state. They want to see that local job creation you have from building a more modern energy scenario in their own state government. So this heavy reliance on a few states to produce a lot of the renewable electrons for the country, I don't know if that's going to be sustainable over the long term. Now, we've seen in the past the states that have tried to do significant reforms of their discoms, particularly on pricing, ending cross-subsidization, charging agriculture, they tend to do pretty poorly in the ballot box not long after. From my own personal experience, having seen Jayalalitha, when she was elected back in 2001 in Tamil Nadu, began charging farmers for the first time in decades and trying to reduce cross-subsidization. You saw in 2004 in the national parliamentary election, the AIDMK won exactly 0 seats in the parliamentary election. And so just after that huge blow at the ballot box, Tamil Nadu government reversed most of the important energy reforms that they'd initiated. You saw it in Andhra Pradesh when Chandrababu Naidu initiated a similar set of energy reforms during his run as chief minister from 94 to 2004. And he lost the 2004 election, and the first announcements by the new government were again reversing a lot of the energy decisions that the Naidu government had made. So we've seen in practice, doing the hard steps in a lot of states as actually those political parties have suffered retribution at the ballot box. So as much as any expert wants to sit down with state governments and talk about charge your farmers for electricity and cross-subsidization, political parties know the ballot box is a fierce opponent to doing the kind of electricity reforms that we all kind of understand are pretty important to be able to do. So, again, looking at the operational capacity of discoms across India, the Power Finance Corporation does what I consider kind of the gold standard of ranking of state-level discoms, looking at operational efficiency, revenue minus the average cost of supply. And they break it down as well by which of the discoms are public versus which of those are private. And again, this is, as I kind of mentioned in my opening, this was one of the drivers for me to decide to take on this project is, when you look at this come out every year, last year was the 11th edition. In a couple of months, we'll get the 12th edition of this report. Private companies aren't perfect. You see a few of them kind of stuck in the middle. but overall, on average, they're doing considerably better than the public run distribution companies in terms of operational efficiency. And again, when you improve operational efficiency, when you cross the break-even threshold financially, when you talk about making some of those investments in energy transition and renewable energy, that gets a lot easier. Or the next order of business, even for the states that are heavy on renewable energy, need to start investing in energy storage. Well, that's a huge other financial burden. And seeing the operational improvements of discoms is going to be very important for India to meet a lot of these self-stated climate targets, not just by the union government, but also by state governments. Now, again, as I kind of indicated before, one thing that I hear a lot when I show this slide, a lot of times the private companies are actually cherry picking the top consumers because a lot of the private discoms tend to be in major urban areas. And the way cross subsidization works, industrial users tend to pay relatively high rates. And so if you've got a city with a lot of industrial and commercial users, you're already taking the cream of the crop, the higher paying customers. And there's certainly a lot of truth to that. But in my opinion, another reason we decided to undertake this project quietly 3 years ago, and I'm actually surprised a lot of folks aren't more familiar with this, but Odisha, for the second time, went back and privatized all 4 of its distribution utilities. As I mentioned in the beginning, they'd done that in the mid 1990s. It was really an abject failure. The state underreported how bad the operations were, so the private companies came in and found that operationally were much worse than what they thought they were buying into. And then you had that massive cyclone in 1999 that knocked out a lot of equipment. So Odisha, this whole idea about urban versus rural, they actually went back 3 years ago and sold a majority stake in all 4 discoms to Tata Power. And you've seen a really quick and sharp turnaround, including the areas that work primarily with rural consumers. So this whole idea that private companies, the model only kind of works with higher paying urban consumers, Odisha is quickly proving that that's not the case, that a private entity, even if they've got a lot of non-urban consumers, can actually initiate significant and quick turnarounds of distribution companies as well. So for those that haven't ducked into it, actually, when we did the formal launch of this report, we had the CEO of Tata Power, Dr. Pravir Sinha, and the Principal Secretary of Energy, Vishal Kumar Dev from the state of Odisha, both talking about the 3-year run of success from this new partnership between Tata and the state of Odisha. So cherry picking the relatively high paying consumers in urban areas, it's a quicker model of success. But what we've seen with Odisha shows that, in fact, a much larger privatization, including with rural consumers, can also be very successful because we're all kind of learning over time. While the models may not have worked very well 20 years ago when some of the initial reforms and privatization happened, everybody's been learning over time and getting the mix better on how to make it kind of work. And I can talk a little bit more about what I've learned on the Odisha Tata example too, if people are interested as we kind of move around. Now, as I kind of indicated before, this is great. The areas private companies have moved into, but some of the big programs by the union government to initiate major reforms across all of India have mostly fallen flat on their face. Again, getting back to the Vajpayee government with the APDRP and the Electricity Act, the Manmohan Singh government's late attempt at doing a bailout and the EGROW program. I will say, we realize we're kind of shooting at a moving target to some extent. In the last couple of years, discoms across India have more or less been improving. There's a couple of new reforms, which again are a little bit less reported than, say, the EGROW program, but the revamped distribution sector scheme that's trying to revise how states offer subsidies to low-paying consumers. Also, the late payment surcharge rules, where states that aren't paying their dues to distribution companies, to generation companies, they basically get cut off from drawing electricity from the central pool. It's still a couple of years in, so I'd like to give it a little bit more time. But these 2 reforms have actually shown real, I think, quick operational improvements and bills getting paid. Are they sustainable over long term? Unlike past reforms, only time will tell. But we also realize a report like this will be helpful in some instances. But actually, there are some pretty good things happening right now for states to improve their own discom operations, partially driven by, I think, a better sizing of some of the union government reform programs that have been announced just in the last couple of years. Today, private firms overall operate 16 of the 70 major discoms. And I say major, a lot of special economic zones might have a kind of a small utility that operates there. So, we might quibble a little bit about how many private discoms there are, because, some of those SEZs are pretty sizable. Some of them are relatively small. But, again, going back to the Power Finance Corporation report, the 70 major discoms in the country, 16 of them are operated by the private sector. There's 11 states in India that actually have private distribution of electric power. Sometimes it's an owner-operator model where they've actually handed over majority ownership to a foreign company. And sometimes, like in Rajasthan, where they have a franchise model where it's short-term in nature, 20-year contracts, and the private company has a limited time to try to turn around operations and to be able to achieve financial success through making those investments. So it's a mix in terms of the type, whether it's owner-operator or a franchise model. Now, again, I talked a little bit about the Odisha example, and it was great to have the leaders from that with the launch of the report that we did just a few weeks ago. As Dr. Singh mentioned, not only did we launch this report, but looking at a few states that we think should seriously consider some of our findings and consider allowing the private sector to have some role in distribution. Instead of just releasing the report into the wild and hoping that people read it, we actually, my colleague Akshat Singh that helped me with the research for this, he and I just did a grand yatra around India. We visited 8 state governments that we think should allow private companies to have some role in distribution. A couple of the states we visited, UP and Maharashtra, already have some private electricity, but we think should consider expanding that. And a number of states we visited, like Tamil Nadu and Kerala, Bihar, do not currently have, other than special economic zones in Tamil Nadu and such, they don't have private distribution of electric power, but they've really kind of shown a lack of ability to make those kind of reforms on their discoms that we think will help India meet its own development goals. So we just came back from a meeting with 8 state governments. It was Bihar, it was UP, it was Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Kerala, Karnataka, Telangana, and Tamil Nadu. And I would say the reaction, we met with both the electricity regulatory commissions as well as the state energy departments. The reaction to the report was mixed. Some states like Bihar, which have very few high-paying customers, very few industrial, they can't see the model on how a private company could come in, and without having those high-paying industrial users, how can you make a market of a state like Bihar? And again, we talked about the Odisha example where Odisha is a little wealthier than Bihar, to be sure, but the profile in terms of agriculture users and such, the model is adapting. Other states, I think we're a little bit more open and willing. UP, for instance, across the last 10 years, a couple of times has talked about expanding private distribution. They didn't have a lot of data kind of showing how to go about that process. So I think our conversations in UP and some other states were pretty useful. I think they really appreciate having the data set in case they start building some political momentum to go back and look at an expanded presence of private companies with distribution. It's also important to point out that private sector is not a panacea. We have within the report a list of the failures because some of these initial attempts at allowing private companies to have distribution haven't went quite as well. And for this report, we interviewed all the private companies, with the exception of Torrent Power that declined to be interviewed. But we interviewed all the rest of the private companies that have distribution companies, as well as the states that house them. And basically, a lot of times the reason for failure, the utility that came in just didn't have the manpower or technical capacity to quickly move about the reforms that they wanted to do. In Gaya and Bihar, for instance, there was a challenge where the state was supposed to co-invest along with the private company. They didn't do so. And so a lot of the customers that might have been last mile that the state was supposed to manage and handle for the transition period, when they didn't do that, You had a lot of consumer backlash against the model, and they felt that it was the private entity that was to blame. And of course, the truth is it's a bit more mixed of a reaction. So there's a range of reasons why some of the privatization and franchising have failed, and it's also important to note that the most recent of the failures goes back more than a decade, and there's actually been a lot of new private ones that have come up since then. So again, this idea that the model is improving over time, you see a lot of the same private entities, Tata, CESC, Torrent, are the same ones that keep coming up again and again and kind of expanding their presence. So the model is improving over time, but clearly, as you can see from this chart, it hasn't been perfect over this time. Now, one of my favorite questions to ask when we're talking to private companies that have taken over distribution is what are the things that you do fastest? What are the quick wins you can do to try to achieve some kind of operational and financial turnaround of the distribution companies? And I think one thing that people don't understand if they haven't ducked into this, private companies actually don't have a free hand on increasing pricing. Pricing, even in the areas that have been privatized, is still guided by the electricity regulatory commissions. And by and large, unless there's some reason that it should vary, they're kind of kept to the same standard on pricing that the state-run discoms have, because a lot of times you've got them working in parallel in the same state. So pricing, there's not as much of a free hand as what I think a lot of outsiders sometimes imagine. They worry that if a private company comes in, they're going to dramatically escalate prices, but they typically don't have the ability to do that. But some of the quick wins that they've got, nobody I think on this call are going to be terribly surprised. They've got a little bit more comfort in cutting off those that are stealing electric power, burying lines when they can. There's a lot of people, especially after the Sobhagya program, where they dramatically expanded distribution to homes. They're not getting billed at all. And so private companies come in and they find that there's a lot of customers that have had lines hooked up that aren't even getting regular billing, therefore aren't paying their bills. And so improving that. But one of the other measures that we found, at least one company that we interviewed talked about, is that when a private company acquires the discom, another one of the quick wins is going into the billing software. A lot of times, presumably because of corruption, large industrial users within a jurisdiction have actually paid to have inside the computer software the price that they're supposed to be paying for electricity has been manually lowered. And so when you go in and you find all these variances, which aren't supposed to be in there, everybody's supposed to have the same rate for category consumer. If you iron those out too, it's a great way to start rebuilding the finances of the discom when the private company takes over. So there's a lot of kind of quick things that a private company can do that help with the operational efficiency just in the first few years. And we actually have a chart in the report that talks about how quickly the losses for discoms have managed to reduce in the first 5 years of a private company taking ownership. In some instances, it drops by 25% losses in the first 5 years. In a lot of instances, it's down 50 to 70% in the first 5 years. So some of these quick wins that you've got on improving billing, cutting off thieves, improving the transparency of pricing, these are all extremely good things that private companies have been able to bring in when they've been given the keys to managing discoms. Private companies also say that, unlike I think some people's perception that are consumers concerned about private companies, are they fearful of that? The private firms we spoke to said that if you manage the process well, you put out a customer complaint line, and when they call it, you help with remediation of energy problems immediately. Once they begin to see that the lights stay on more, that problems are fixed a little bit faster, those are all quick wins too that give consumers comfort. So surprisingly, of all the companies we interviewed, none of them said consumer concerns about changing from a public sector discom to a private one. Not a single one said that that was an insurmountable obstacle in this whole process of handover to private companies. So consumer adoption and blowback really wasn't a thing that people had brought up. And in fact, in the report, we actually take a look, what's been the electoral feedback in states that have actually seen franchising and privatization? Because again, a lot of times it's done piecemeal within states, a couple of districts or a city. And we look back at what's been the political blowback. Have actually re-election rates of candidates in those areas went down as retribution among other factors, of course, but as retribution for privatization of distribution. And as you can see, actually, there's virtually no change. And in fact, in some instances, reelection rates are a little bit higher in areas that have been privatized. So again, this concern that there's political blowback against allowing private companies to have a larger hand. The data on state elections in the years after an entity was privatized show that reelection rates are approximately the same as candidates writ large in the same state. So the political blowback wasn't quite as strong, but the biggest blowback that companies talk about is actually from the employees and employee unions of the state-run discoms. And again, I imagine for a lot of people in this room, it's not terribly surprising, but that group and fearful about job losses, because a lot of times private companies do think about redundant labor force and things like that. The management, you want to change out the management to get more professional executive style management of a discom. So the management and the employee unions, that remains the biggest obstacles to change and reform in this area. Again, we're learning over time, and a lot of times if a state is privatizing just a district or a city, if labor is cut, they can be inducted into other parts of the electricity machinery in the state. But in Odisha example, you need to find the appropriate model where there's a payment program, people can retire early, or they can move into other parts of the service, even if it's not going to be in the electricity sector. So again, Odisha's got, I think, a very powerful example about how to manage these issues on labor and management. Because if you're taking over the entire state, you don't have other places you can ship the employees to if the private entity sees them as redundant and looks to cut staff. So again, Odisha's got a lot of examples kind of for us all on how this can be done. Now, again, this is a report about privatization, whether it's as a short-term franchisee or as an owner-operator that takes equity stake in the distribution utilities. Some states have been able to initiate meaningful reforms of their state-run discoms. And again, I mentioned before, Gujarat and Haryana are two that kind of stick out as the top of the list. They've done a great job on reforming the state-run discoms. States like that, they don't need to see this report at all, most likely. They've been able to take those hard decisions. Sometimes to a hammer, everything's a nail. We realize this report is not applicable actually to a few states that have been able to do that. Now, the last thing I'll mention, is this report. It's not simply a look back, but we did try to pull the best ideas. If a state government, let's just say Kerala wakes up tomorrow and says, all right, kind of an interesting idea. How do we go about doing that? We actually, within this report, have a programmatic checklist, based on our interviews with the other state governments and the private companies. How do you go about thinking about privatizing? Maybe it's, do you consider doing an owner-operator model? Do you consider a franchise and the merits and demerits of each of the models? How do you choose an area of operation? Evaluating the existing performance to make sure that a private entity understands what they're buying into. Some of the socio-political factors. So we've got a checklist as well. So we try to make this a bit of a how-to guide. So if other state governments are considering allowing private companies to have a hand in distribution of electric power, how do you begin conceptualizing the process, based on what other states in India have done? And I will say for this report, I have been asked some questions about how does this compare to the US model or other markets? We actually didn't take other countries into consideration at all. The entire report, soup to nuts, is all based on India's own practical experience in this. So, I've got a little bit of knowledge about how the US system works, but frankly, its applicability to what you see in India. The two models are so far apart that we figured, in some reports we do, international models are useful and instructive. In this instance, we actually had enough to draw from India's own experience to be able to develop, this kind of checklist for privatization for states that might look and consider the model for being able to do so. So if it's okay, Dr. Singh, that's kind of like the capture, the models there, the operational improvements, when it makes sense and when it doesn't, how companies turn around discoms, some of the challenges they face in doing so, and the failures. Not every privatization has been a rip-roaring success. So, we do look at it and say, when you see the bad examples, we have lessons to learn. That's kind of what we're trying to capture for this. And all in all, hopefully this will help India meet its industrialization goals, its goals for human development, as well as energy modernization. Three things that we wanted to keep first and foremost in mind when we were doing this report. So that's the report. Happy to take any questions or anything that people want to bring up.
Sure, Rick, that's interesting. And we are going to go to the questions. I'm going to request people either raise your hand. I can already see Kumar Pratap has raised his hand. I'm going to request others also. And if you want to put your question on the chat box, please feel free to do so. And I have my colleague, Dr. Ashok Vishandas, also here. I'm going to see whether he would also like to ask a question. But to just start thinking about this, Rick, my own thoughts are that about 20 years ago, we were grappling with very high leakages in this sector. And that seems to have been addressed reasonably well now. I don't know if you have noted that in your report. The other thing is when you talk about the privatization or the private sector participation, and you did speak about Tata. Tata is a private sector, of course. They have their own challenges. And I really like the way you acknowledge that the private sector is not the panacea of all ills. There could be times when even the private sector is not significantly contributing positively. You know, in the collection, private sector has a different yardstick, different strategy, and different role. And to that extent, even that has been discussed a lot. So on these two observations, if you would like to have a comment, I would simply like to ask you, because you've done across the country travel as well as you have done the study, and I'm sure with your past experience, you must have seen the international, um, call it the empirical evidence internationally. How do you ensure profitability in this area? Because the country's topography, the country's geography, and then the uh, look, the requirements that are so very heterogeneous: industry, the size of the country, the agriculture sector, and then the housing. The length and breadth of the country is so large. Monitoring it, evaluating it, ensuring there are no leakages, and there is profitability maintained. And as you know, the cost of power is also very varied. You have the electric power coming from the hydro. The solar is now being distributed in houses, expected on the rooftops. And then we have still not harnessed wind power sufficiently, but then wind power, we are working on it now. So what is the experience in other countries to make it profitable for for the government in this sector? So those would be two observations and a question, please.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I mean, losses for discoms by and large are coming down. And to me, I mean, you've seen short-term blips with some of the past reform programs, but this has been sustained across a little bit longer period because of some of the discom reforms and some of the tough decisions states have taken. So writ large, the story is improving, but you still have dramatic losses in some of the states like UP, Telangana, and others. So it's a state by state approach. Some states, this work for a range of reasons is not going to be applicable, but some states that just haven't been able to make those reforms apace with other state governments, we think might want to consider, at least for industrial areas, at least to, but I know it's a devilish choice, right? Because, you don't want to hand over the folks that are meant to cover cross subsidization. But in India, you've got industrial consumers that are paying a lot of times, 25, 30, 40% higher for energy than you have in say the United States and Europe. So when India is trying to attract global manufacturing to come in, electricity is not the only thing, but India should be price competitive in electricity versus, Europe and the United States in places, and is not when you think about industrial users. So again, this is more for the states that have not been able to follow suit, as you rightly point out, the improvements in losses and curbing that. Here in the United States, private companies have about a 70% share of electricity distribution. Rates a lot of times are set in consultation with state governments. In that sense, it's not so very different, because in India, private companies too, right? The rates would be done in conjunction with the rulings of the electricity regulatory commissions. So private companies here have a much bigger hand. But I think your core question is how do you sort of balance consumer interest and pricing and that kind of stuff? And it's not so very different, where here in the United States, governments have a handle to play on rates as well. But your point on the energy mix and renewables is pretty fascinating. It's one thing to say, like, a private company, operational improvements, they're going to go to renewables. It's not always the case. I mean, if they'll go wherever the price is, the mirror dispatch, if they buy electricity for a low price from coal-fired thermal, they'll do that, or run-of-the-river hydro. But again, one of the really neat examples, I don't want to sound like I'm doing a commercial for Tata Power. This was funded by a private foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, that was not funded by Tata. But the one thing that Tata Power has done, first in Mumbai, and they're about to get launched in Odisha, is allowing a green tariff. So I know that a lot of U.S. companies that they're making these big announcements about getting to zero carbon by X date. They need to be able to buy electricity in markets where they have big operations and make it as green as possible. And a lot of states in India, on paper, they do have right of open access, where you can buy electricity from any supplier that you want to. In practice, it doesn't often happen. They don't want high-paying consumers leaving the grid, hiring their own deals. You see, grid migration tariffs that are suddenly brought up out of thin air. You see wheeling charges that are increased by state governments for private companies to try to, source from solar plants that may be a ways away. But Tata is now offering a green tariff, and the word from Tata is that both in Mumbai, and they expect when they launch in Odisha, there's going to be a lot of take-up. So companies and individuals can start choosing themselves a green tariff, and a private company that sees that as a market will move into that. You haven't seen a state utility that I'm aware of in India that allows a green tariff, but a private company has initially. So you don't know where the private sector's mind is, where they're going to source from. We like to think they would go green and they're saying the right things. But at least in this example, there's actually enough consumer interest in India to source green power that when a private company offers it, they kind of jump on. But yeah, I take your point. I mean, private companies, again, they're not the heroes here. They go to where the money's to be made. And if the money's to be made by providing electricity last mile, they'll do it. And if it's not, that's going to be a tough one. It's been a delicate balance in Odisha. Again, private sector drivers, where's the first place they're going to go in a state? To the high-paying customers and make sure reliability improves and they're getting paid. And this is where, again, the model, and this is what Vishal Kumar Dev, the power secretary from the state, was talking about at our launch. The state understands that. And they actually have agreed to continue maintaining services for some of the tribal areas and others that a private company would go to last, once they have carved out as much, profit making as they can from the major urban areas and such. So it takes a very robust, mature discussion between the private company and the state to figure out what that balance is. Because as you kind of indicate, you got to understand what the private sector is before you take this leap and give them the keys to the car. They will go to where the money is. They will not go to do things to help people unless that's where, And so this balance you see where Odisha will continue to build out infrastructure and maintain service in some of the groups that Tata would probably go to last. That's an important balance. And if a state's not willing to take that and really carry it out, again, it's a recipe for disaster. So yeah, eyes wide open. Some states are doing a lot better. And this report is not applicable. Private companies, we have to understand the motivations. But the model overall, in terms of pricing and the balance, is in some ways in India not so very different from what we've got here in the United States.
There are a couple of questions in the chat box, but before I invite you, Rick, to the chat box, I would like to first explore whether my colleague, Dr. Ashok Vishandas, has a question.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Charan. And thank you, our this for Mr. Eric Rossow. It was a wonderful exposition, and I really wonder how come you have such a depth on Indian politics, the economics, and I think you it is amazing. And many Indians, I can tell you, don't know what you know about India. Uh, Having said this, I really think that the investment in the farmers and the farmers' welfare has a very high ROI, return on investment, in terms of the attention, the policy orientation, and the bias towards the agriculture policy compared to the other social welfare measures. So to what extent government can extend the so-called, I would say, still the bias towards the farmers, and in terms of, because we have to remember the the workforce in agriculture is about 45.5%, and it gives just about 16% in the GDP. So all these said, and 86% of farmers are marginal and small. So to what extent their plight can attract the government intention, uh, whether visible concessions and other things in terms of the electoral dividend in the forthcoming election. So I wanted your views on this.
Yeah. Maybe I'll tie that together because I see two of the questions in the chat as well. One of them talks about agriculture and the other one talks about rooftop. So I think there's three great topics, which is competing models. How do you make this win? And it's got to be politically viable. Your point's right on. And I think this idea about, rooftop as well, all this has got to be politically viable. Otherwise, a state can't do it. Or if they do, they're going to be voted out of office, which, they certainly don't want either. I think the government's thinking on this by and large is for the folks that they know by this point they can't risk charging for electric power, otherwise there's political repercussions. The whole point now is to try to get them off the grid. If you can't keep them on the grid and keep reliable electric power and get them to pay, can you get them off the grid? And the KUSM program, is obviously a big part of that to try to get more farmers to be self-sufficient with electric power. And I, to me, if the state feels that they have the capacity to charge farmers, if they think they can do it, or at least to offer that subsidy directly, because this is one of the challenges. It was mentioned in the chat box. What about the subsidy to farmers? It's not really a subsidy. Basically, the regulatory commission tells the utilities you just can't charge them or charge them a nominal amount, but there is no direct state subsidy that's given. Now, the reformed linked distribution sector scheme does try to prompt states to begin charging farmers and then give them a subsidy so they can pay the bill to get them in the habit. Maybe the RDSS will take off and grow, and that'll be one of the solutions where states, instead of implicitly having the subsidy by bailing out the discom, it'll be an overt subsidy where they actually, give people the ability to pay the bills, and then they start getting charged. So that's one model. Make the subsidy transparent rather than burying it and forcing the discounts to be broke all the time. But the other model, which frankly it feels like they're moving at even a little bit faster, is finding ways to get the most heavily subsidized customers off the grid, make them self-reliant. And part of that is the KUSM program, and part of that is the rooftop program that the Prime Minister just announced. It sounds like you're doing a great thing for people, and you certainly are by putting rooftop solar on and giving people at least a little bit of reliable electric power during sunny days. But also this, is quietly going to be a massive bailout program again for discoms, because I imagine a lot of the folks are going to be targeting for this. And I was just with the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy when I was in Delhi. It's going to be targeting the bottom of the rung consumers, the folks, again, that don't pay full freight for electric power. And if this helps get them off the grid and therefore discom finances improve, the way that rooftop has been working so far in India, it's mostly been driven by state government policymaking. And, across the world, when people think about putting rooftop solar on, it's a big upfront expense. And the idea is that you amortize it over time because you get paid for electricity that you sell back in the grid because of some form of net metering policy. But again, a lot of states in India, the state discoms are broke. The last thing they want is, 500,000 consumers suddenly trying to sell electricity to them when they're already cash strapped. So the previous work on rooftop, I think, is other than Gujarat and to some extent Kerala, there aren't that many states that have really been able to come close to even meeting their own rooftop targets. A lot of states, fall pretty flat because, all right, it's okay when 1,000 people do it, but when 10,000 or 100,000 people put rooftop on and they're trying to sell back to you, it's problematic. So I think the answer to both of these is pretty similar. The rooftop program and some of the work on agriculture, get them off the grid, get them self-sufficient. They'll have better access to reliable power, and it'll improve discount finances. I think that's kind of the model. And then we've got second order impact, which other people are studying. The KUSUM program, if suddenly farmers in India are incentivized to irrigate during the daytime when you've got a good solar profile, they shift to more water intensive crops, which has water stress. You need more water when you irrigate during the daytime because of evaporation. So I do think some of these programs like KUSUM, they need to be better, I think, assessment about second order impacts of these programs. But that kind of captures, I think, both, which I think makes sense. Charge them and bring them in the fold if you can. And if you can't, get them off the grid and make them self-sufficient. Everybody kind of wins from that program too. So that's kind of the dual tracks I see between agriculture and the rooftop programs.
Kumar?
I'm
Kumar has
unmuted
raised.
now.
Yeah, Kumar.
On this rooftop solar bit, don't you think right now India is even? There's no shortage of electricity. There are 30,000 megawatts of power generation projects which are stranded because each unit of power that is bought by the discoms, there is a loss now as per the PSC report that you have referred to about 25 paise per unit of power. At the power distribution end, there is a loss of 30,000 crore on a per annum basis. So if you have these 1 crore households generating their power and getting compensated by the discom on net metering basis, are you certain? I think the finances of discoms will be adversely affected, given that there is no shortage. Now they would have to pay the fixed charges of electricity anyway, and the demand is going down. So in terms of overall discom finances, I'm not too certain whether this would be positive or negative. This was my first question. I have an observation on the main part of your report, which is discom finances, private discom finances. I think one of the most important success stories in India as far as privatization of discoms goes is Delhi power distribution. From a point of over 50% AT&C losses at the point of privatization in 2002, there right now all the discoms in Delhi, and there are 3 private sector and 1 public sector, they are down to 8%. It has helped manage the political economy because you don't have to raise the tariffs to the same extent, given that all these revenues which used to be consumed in theft are coming to the discoms. There are 2 other important reasons why the Delhi discom example needs to be replicated across the country. And one is that your companies which came in for Delhi discom were domestic companies, as opposed to the Orissa privatization, where an American company came in. Because these are politically sensitive sectors, the chances of privatization to succeed are higher when they're domestic companies. That is one. And secondly, as per these are regulated, the pricing is regulated. So what has happened in the case of Delhi is that the government of Delhi, because they provide power for free, for example, more than half of the households in Delhi get free power because they consume less than 200 units per month. The government of Delhi is providing a subsidy of over 3,000 crores on a per annum basis so that their political compulsions do not adversely affect the finances of the DISCOM. I think these are important reasons why Delhi should be replicated, and these are some of the ways in which the political economy of privatization has been managed. I'd love to have your comments on the rooftop solar and the impact it would have on the DISCOM finances, and secondly, on the Delhi example. Thank you.
Yeah, on the first point, I mean, I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. I thought I covered that in my latter part, but yeah, I agree. If ultimately the rooftop program, the belief is that customers will, produce electricity for themselves and then sell some to the DISCOM, that's going to be dangerous for DISCOM. So I fully agree with that point. And again, that was like the state programs that you had before on private on rooftop. A lot of the idea was that consumers adopt it and then they sell electricity back in. And states like UP that announced that retracted it later because they were worried about the heavy burden that would cause. If this time it's done pure play, not expecting consumers sell it back in, and we still have a lot of details for this new program that have not yet been announced. If it's pure play, they will help subsidize the cost of putting it up for personal use. And therefore, these customers that tend to be, heavy burdens on the DISCOMs are off the grid. That is clearly quite positive for the DISCOM. So I think if the model, when we finally see it finally announced and released, is more about getting people off the grid that were heavily subsidized, great for the DISCOM. If it actually tries to incentivize net metering, which I don't think it will, but if it does, then yeah, it could be a bit of a drag. So we're all eagerly kind of awaiting when the final details for the program are announced to see how they manage that. So it could kind of go either way, but I suspect it's going to be about, getting people off the grid and therefore easing pressure on DISCOMs.
All right. I must close now because we have the other session. Yeah.
Sir, please one question. I ask only one question.
Mr. Singh, you should have put it in the chat box.
Only one question, sir. I just
Very
wanted to
brief.
ask.
Yeah, but please be very brief.
Yeah. I think in most of the countries in South Globe, they are all at the, the developing stage. Why you are thinking about the India? Why not other countries in the South Globe?
The only thing I know is India. I've spent 25 years only working with India. So if you ask me even about neighboring countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, my knowledge is pretty limited. So I'll leave it to others that know those other markets to maybe take this work forward, and hopefully it'll be useful.
Sure. So I must thank each one of you for making the discussion so rich, the participants. I have to thank Rick for agreeing to come and speak at our forum on such an important issue. I want to make a special thanks to Mr. Kumar Pratap for sharing with us some information on Delhi, which even I wasn't aware of. So very educating. And if Mr. Pratap, you can contact us, I would like to speak to you at length. I have to make an important announcement that we at EGROW next Friday probably are considering to have a discussion on guaranteed MSP. It'll be between 4 to 6. And I think I'll send you, of course, the flyer. I think you should please pencil it down. The other topic which is scheduled for 23rd actually is on drugs in India. That's another interesting topic, but we may shift to guaranteed MSP. So I would request you to please join us and consider that. I also want to say that every week EGROW does programs on economic literacy. Do look up our website. Every evening, 1 hour online, we do it from 7:30 to 8:30. I'm running out of time because we have to prepare for the other program. I want to once again thank you, Rick, a lot for being with us, and thank all of you to have shared your expertise and made the session so lively. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singh.